I'm Stephen Best of the Rationalist Society of St. Louis, welcoming you to Freethinking 101. We invite you to examine your biases, your prejudices, your mindset, your values, your religion, in short, to reach into the recesses of your mind and sweep out the cobwebs you may find there. Tonight our guest is Pat Inniss, who is president of the Rationalist Society, and he's going to tell us something about fundamentalist politics. Now, I think that calls for some definitions, and perhaps you can tell us what is a fundamentalist, and does this relate to the Christian tradition?
Yeah, I guess what I really mean is when you talk about domestic politics and fundamentalists, you're really talking about the Christian fundamentalists, and those are people that are also referred to as a new Christian right, which gives you sort of an idea what their political stance is. Mm-hmm. Religiously, I guess how you can define a fundamentalist is, they have what they call the fundamentals, which are the virgin birth, the Christ's redemption from man's sins through his crucifixion, the resurrection of Christ, the second coming of Christ, and biblical inerrancy. Now, if you hold all those religious principles, then you could be aptly described as a fundamentalist. Also, fundamentalists are, really when you think of fundamentalists, you think of Protestants because, well, the Protestantism really allows a wider range of theological views than Catholicism, of course, which is much more highly structured and regimented. Yeah. And of course, you always see people getting booted out of the Catholic Church. You don't hear people being booted out of Protestantism too often. But I think we have a pretty good image of what fundamentalists are, but technically that's how you would define a fundamentalist.
I see. In the Reagan administration, I think fundamentalist politics may have come to fruition of a sort, and I'm wondering if you might review some of the things that went on during that period of time.
Well, if you look at the ideology which underlies Reaganism, and there's a few areas in which it's sort of easy to see the influence of fundamentalist thinking, of religious thinking. Mm-hmm. It wasn't always admitted to, but occasionally it was admitted to. But if you examine certain policies, I guess Reagan was a very strong supporter of Israel, and that sort of fits in very well with one of the primary things that fundamentalists have picked up on is their concept of premillennialism. Now, premillennialism is the idea, it's associated with the second coming, which is one of the tenets of fundamentalist dogma, that Christ will return to the earth. And premillennialism, they believe that Christ will return and establish a 1,000-year reign of peace and tranquility. Post-millennialism, what happens is it's just on the other side of Armageddon. It's relative, the 1,000 years relative to Armageddon is what you're talking about pre and post. But right. These notions come from the book of Daniel and Revelation, and some people who were inclined to view things politically, take the Bible literally and interpret them in political context, look at history in the 20th century and interpret that in terms of premillennialism. Now, where that fits in with some of our politics is that they have interpreted the return of the Jews to Israel, the Zionists to Israel, to be an indicator that we are somewhere closer to the occurrence of the return of Christ. They read the Bible to mean that, the forces of evil or the beast and the Antichrist are interpreted to be the Soviet Union. Of course, the return of the Zionists to Israel is something that was predicted by the Bible before the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. So if you tend to look at things in those terms, you could say, well, gee, I hope that the Jews do return to Israel, and maybe even I hope that there's this war of Armageddon. You might not be as tempted to avoid such a war, as a matter of fact, because the the result of the fulfillment of these prophecies, of course, is the second coming of Christ, and of course, you being one of the true believers will be saved.
Yeah.
So,
are the fundamentalists going to have to look for a new beast now that Mr. Gorbachev seems to be tamed a bit?
well, these myths are amazingly flexible. Now, I don't think the Bible ever used the word Russia or the Soviet Union or even Gorbachev or Stalin or any words like that. So it's quite possible that this whole notion will be modified to fit whatever the new scenario is. If somehow Iran were to emerge as a much stronger power in that part of the world, well, they've already got the reputation. I think they don't have a very warm spot in the hearts of many Americans, whether they're fundamentalists or not. But you have to realize that this is a relatively recent theory that they've come up with. It was only in the last, since the Bolshevik Revolution, I guess, is when people started to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. If you check out fundamentalist writing, some of the early writings, they have nothing bad to say about socialism. Socialism is, of course, some of this actually predated the rise of communism in the Soviet Union, but in terms of socialism, there was no strong criticism of socialism, and actually it was tacitly approved in some of the early fundamentalist writing. But that's where we talk about the adaptability of the mythology to the current politics of the time.
Yeah.
There's other reasons. I ought to mention,
go
though,
ahead.
that the influence of fundamentalists isn't only in international politics. You can look at some of the domestic politics too. Although it's tainted our relations with other countries, you could say, it's also caused certain problems at home in dealing rationally with some of the problems of governing the nation. If you look at, I guess James Watt is sort of the classic example of a fundamentalist person in a high government position.
A fundamentalist bureaucrat.
Fundamentalist bureaucrat, quite a deadly combination. But everybody's pretty much familiar with the way he distinguished himself as Secretary of the Interior. But his policies, I guess, in the context of fundamentalism and believing that the earth was, the demise of the earth was imminent, may have made good sense. I mean, if you only believe that the earth is about 6,000 years old and maybe it only has a couple of hundred years to go, why worry about the environment? I mean, even the gloomiest environmentalist forecaster probably would say that human life could hold out on the earth at the current rate of consumption of our resources until the coming of James Watt or perhaps even Ronald Reagan's Armageddon.
Is the creationist view one of the fundamentals of fundamentalism?
Well, when they talk about biblical inerrancy, that sweeps up a whole bunch of things that you could say are part of their basic philosophy. So fundamentalists, of course, has spent a lot of energy combating the teaching of the theory of evolution. Evolution is, I guess we can get into that a little bit later, because it's quite, their philosophy toward evolution is quite highly developed. They've developed their own, of course, rival to evolution, creation science, which, I sort of have to bite my tongue every time I say the term creation science. But that is, they're piecing together of whatever evidence they can come up with to support their point of view that the earth was basically created in the way that is described in the Bible.
In Genesis.
In Genesis.
Even though there are a couple different versions of it in Genesis. Yeah. Who are some of the most prominent fundamentalists that we find in politics these days?
Well, some of them are a lot of them are household names now.
Yeah.
A lot of these people actually distinguish themselves as in the field of religion before entering politics, but I guess the most prominent person is probably Jerry Falwell. Now, the interesting thing about Jerry Falwell is he had a tremendous change of heart in terms of his views of the role of religion in politics or in government. Formerly, Jerry Falwell had thought, as the same way a lot of other religious leaders thought, that religious people shouldn't be involved in politics. And he'd walk around telling you that the Bible says that it's not for men of the cloth to become involved in politics. Now, this is probably because he had witnessed a lot of liberal religious leaders who he didn't approve of becoming involved in politics. And it's, you know, when you see that, it's sort of easy to be critical of other people and say, well, they shouldn't be involved in politics at all. But he came up with a very profound change of heart, and as you know, he became one of the really major forces in conservative politics in this country, with his founding, with a few others, of the group the Moral Majority, which was heavily composed of people with very fundamentalist religious beliefs.
I wonder how moral and how much of a majority the moral majority is.
Well, that was a problem with the size of the moral majority, and the claims made for the size of the moral majority are one of the early problems that they encountered, because at first Jerry Falwell went around telling people that they had about 4 million members, quite a large membership roll, but this turned out to be a gross exaggeration, and actually the whole political clout of the New Christian Right has probably been somewhat exaggerated, but they aren't really to be taken lightly. It's sort of hard to measure the political clout of the New Christian Right, but it's probably somewhat exaggerated by the amount of media exposure that they do have through numerous television outlets. Jerry Falwell, of course, has his own TV show, and he's been known to make use of his TV airtime for some very, what I would consider, blatantly partisan appeals to his listeners.
Pat Robertson is another one.
Well, Pat Robertson, of course, he actually went political himself, although not very successfully, some people would say, fortunately. But just to cover some of the other people, there are, a fairly wide range of fundamentalists. Some people would classify Ronald Reagan as a fundamentalist. In many ways, he did fit the fundamentalist mold. He apparently paid a lot of attention to fundamentalist philosophy. He had fundamentalists in his cabinet. I guess he was influenced by fundamentalists. Now, you figure, there's a guy that listens to an astrologer, can you call him a fundamentalist? Well, maybe not. But he did apparently believe that there was going to be an Armageddon, which for a person with their finger on the trigger, you may cause you to lose a little sleep at night. But he sort of toned that down during his presidency. He toned down a lot of things during his presidency. But these are things which sort of, it's not a black and white thing. Christian fundamentalists really don't all fit in the same pot. You can't really define, just like any other group, they're somewhat of a heterogeneous mix.
Some are more fundamental than others.
Dan Quayle, he's an interesting character in the current administration. Dan Quayle is not really a card-carrying fundamentalist. I don't think you could consider him that. But he was close enough for the fundamentalists to give him very important political backing. Of course, he's from Indiana, which is for quite a long time been a very, I guess you could call it a hotbed of conservatism.
I hail from there.
Oh, you do? Well, you can tell us about that, perhaps.
I'm glad to be in St. Louis.
But Dan was elected, I guess, to the seat formerly held by Birch Bayh. Birch was a long-standing, well-respected liberal senator, and pretty near the top of the hit list for numerous conservative groups. Dan Quayle fit the criteria demanded by fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, the New Christian Right, and the other conservative groups. And without their backing, it's very doubtful whether he ever would have been elected senator. And of course, the rest is history.
Yeah.
One other guy I ought to mention is sort of a different kind of fundamentalist. Here's another person that's not really in government, but Paul Weyrich is a Catholic, and there are a few Catholic fundamentalists. Now, Paul Weyrich, to give you an idea where he's coming from, he was so conservative that when the Roman Catholic Church changed their liturgy, liberalized it,
yeah.
you probably objected to that word, But when they changed their liturgy, he abandoned the Roman Catholic Church and became
It was beyond the pale.
too much for him. He became a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Apparently he felt that was more true to the tradition. Now he's a leader of a group called the Committee for Survival of a Free Congress, and they've got a lot of backing. They're really bankrolled by a guy, Joseph Coors. He's a very prominent...
The beer man.
The beer man, yes.
That's not a commercial.
Well, we know about Joseph Coors' labor policies and his conservative politics. And Weyrich is a very influential man, no doubt about it. He was also in on the founding of the moral majority with our friend Jerry Falwell, and he helped name the moral majority. He's a very smart man.
Yeah.
Some of the earlier, I guess I shouldn't neglect, you can go back a little bit and go back to Carl McIntyre. He was a minister, most prominent in the 50s and 60s, but I guess he gained most of his notoriety for his support of the Vietnam War. And then, of course, you've got people like Phyllis Schlafly and Senator Dannenmeyer, who sort of also fit the fundamentalist mold.
Yeah. There are a number of them in the Congress.
Right.
It seems that all these people are conservatives. Is there a relationship between fundamentalism and conservative orientation?
Well, you wouldn't think so naturally, but I don't think that all fundamentalists are conservative. On social issues, it certainly seems that most of them are. Most of the most outspoken ones are very conservative.
Yeah.
I tried to, in the research I did, I didn't really find evidence of liberal fundamentalists, but when you look at their views, it's sort of easy to understand why they would oppose such things as liberalization of divorce laws, say. Equal rights for women, of course, is one of the targets that they've chosen.
Birth control and related matters.
Birth control and freedom of choice, yes. These are things which, well, on the abortion thing, it's, the connection there.
That cuts across a little more, yeah.
But it's even hard to figure out why they do oppose freedom of choice in that issue, not for biblical reasons, apparently, but that is something that is a conservative position, and if, apparently the fundamentalists tend to take these positions, so they all end up most of them end up on the conservative side of the...
Would this be a fair statement that most fundamentalists are conservatives, but the other way around doesn't necessarily hold? Not all conservatives are fundamentalists.
There are freethinkers who are
conservatives.
Conservatives, right. And
right.
I guess maybe there are fundamentalist freethinkers too. I'm not sure exactly how you would describe it.
That sounds a little odd.
But we can no doubt say that there are free-thinking conservatives. There are all kinds of conservatives. Conservatives, right. Political conservatives for various reasons. Some of them are good reasons.
Fundamentalists have been identified as normally Protestants. And you mentioned one or two Catholics, but is there a strand of fundamentalism in the Catholic orientation?
Well, yeah, there is. Once again, now the Catholic Church is so structured that there are, of course, you've heard about people that were religious fundamentalists in Catholicism. There's been some struggle, of course, I guess, following the push toward ecumenism on the part of Catholic conservatives. But in terms of Catholicism, the link between their religious conservatism, or fundamentalism, and political fundamentalism has never been really strongly established. Now, it's interesting because for some time, Catholicism has been linked to liberalism in some respect because there are many liberal Catholic leaders. Some of them have become involved in social movements.
And the Latin American situation, many of the Catholics in Latin America are what we might call the good guys. And and persecuted by their governments because of that.
Right.
They're siding with the people.
Yes. Well, John F. Kennedy, of course, was Catholic. Now, the election of Kennedy in 1960 was no doubt a major turning point in the perception of Catholics in the country. Mm-hmm. And that carried a very long-lasting halo effect for Catholics in politics. But actually, if you look at the number of Catholics that are prominent in the New Christian Right, it's relatively small. You can go back a few years. You go back in the 30s, and you have good old Father Coughlin, who was a very prominent leader in the fundamentalist movement of his time, a Catholic priest who was had a nationwide ministry and made very strong forays into politics. At one point, he was practically at the verge of forming a national political party based on his religious following, and that would have been a coalition which included Protestants. Mm-hmm. So he, in a way, sort of almost downplayed his Catholicism, and strangely enough, he came up, in almost in political alliance with some groups that were very staunchly anti-Catholic, such as white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which are anti-Catholic and fundamentalist.
An analogy to that would have been Pat Robertson, the way he softened himself on certain fundamentalist issues to gain support.
But there are issues. But what happens here is these groups, which tend to be in conflict, such as Catholics and fundamentalist Protestants, can come together on certain issues that they agree on, and that's been demonstrated very well in their, you have to say, fairly successful campaign against abortion rights for women.
Yeah.
These groups, now the truce between fundamentalist Protestants and Catholics to cooperate on this issue is at times very tenuous, because although fundamentalists may oppose abortion rights, and a Catholic may oppose abortion rights on such other issues as gun control, capital punishment, school integration, they may be at totally opposite ends of the spectrum, and that quite often happens. And actually, you see a very strong strain of anti-Catholicism throughout a lot of fundamentalist literature. You can walk into a bookstore that caters to fundamentalists and find books out on the shelves that are highly critical of the Catholic Church. And, from a perspective, of course, that probably wouldn't be shared by freethinkers, but it's interesting to see how these, two groups cooperate and contest each other.
Yeah. Is there any message that fundamentalism might have to rationalists?
Well,
do we have anything to fear from them, or they from us, or whatever?
The primary thing, I guess, to me is that fundamentalists are really very strongly opposed to, well, humanism, I guess, is really the bugaboo for fundamentalists. Now,
secular humanism.
Secular humanism. Of course, they will, they very seldom even bother to specify secular humanism. Humanism in and of itself. One of the leading figures in fundamentalism is Tim LaHaye. Mm-hmm. He's written this book, The Battle for the Mind, very popular book.
Are you recommending that we encourage our listeners and viewers to run out and get his book, or?
Well, you might do it if you like a little light reading. The book has got a few things going for it. The interesting thing about this book is that it's primarily an attack on humanism. The book, the title of the book, The Battle for the Mind, is really addressed to the struggle between humanism and Christianity for what they consider to be control of the nation, the fate of the nation.
Yeah, I expect there's a lot of misunderstanding, probably in the book, about what humanism is.
Well, I think most humanists would say their presentation of humanism is somewhat distorted, but their opinion of humanism, there's no doubt about that. Let me read you one quote here. It says, most of the evils in the world today can be traced to humanism. And they blame humanism for everything from, well, for everything, for everything bad. Yeah. But one of the best parts about the book, and one of the most interesting parts, is in the appendix. They have a preliminary questions for candidates to determine their position on morals. Now, the first question here isn't really surprising. It says, do you believe that this country was founded on a belief in God and the moral principles of the Bible? Do you concur that it has been departing from these principles and needs to return to them? Now, here you're posing a religious litmus test for our candidates.
It sounds like it.
But my favorite question, do you favor capital punishment for capital offenses? This is question 14. Now, if you look up in the dictionary, find the definition of what a capital offense or a capital crime is. Well, gee, it's defined as a crime for which the punishment is death. So what they're saying is, do you favor the death penalty for crimes which have a punishment, a penalty of the death penalty? So it makes you
loaded question.
Well, it certainly at least makes you question the competence of a person that would pose a question like that. But a lot of these things, this is their question, supposedly a questionnaire on candidates' position on moral issues. A lot of these things don't really have much to do with. One of the questions is, do you favor a reduction in taxes to allow families more spendable income? None of these questions deal with a candidate's ability to make a contribution or an improvement to the quality of life, to the efficiency with which government runs, to the increasing of promotion of world peace. These are very tightly defined questions which really just are aimed at establishing the person's dogma.
Yeah.
So this is the real danger, I feel, in the new Christian right, in Christian fundamentalism, is that it's really taking religion and making it something that is going to be used to determine a person's position in society.
They have their own agenda and beliefs, and they want to fit everyone else into that mold.
Exactly what they want to do.
Okay. Well, Pat, I want to thank you very much for being with us this evening and clarifying some of what is going on, and still going on, I believe, in the Bush administration. Those of you in our listening audience, we would like to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch with us and talk to us about our programs and maybe suggest other things you might like to have us work with in one of our programs, our phone number is 298-6649. Or you can write us at the Rationalist Society of St. Louis, P.O. Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri 63130. We would be pleased to hear from you. Thank you very much.